Hilchas Tumas Meis Perek Shisha. Now we learned this already, just to say it again. The din is that by oil, you don't say lovot, for example. You don't even say less than lovot. In other words, if you have an area, you have a roof, that's an oil. And in that roof there's a hole. That roof there's a hole, regardless of how big the hole is. If there's a roof, there's a hole in that roof. So under that hole doesn't have a din of oil ames, even though it's a very small hole. It's less than a tefach al tefach. But under that hole, there's no din of tumas ames. And al derezeh, if there would be, for example, tumah under that hole, so that tumah wouldn't extend to the rest of the oil, even though that hole is very small. But since lepel, the tumah is not under the oil, or there's an area which is not under an oil, so that area doesn't have anything to do with that. That's not an extension of the oil. Now, even though we learned, for example, that if you have, for example, a tefach al tefach, so then the tumah goes out through the tefach al tefach. Say, if the tefach on tefach is a side, the wall, or the tefach and the tefach is the ceiling, by medvar mamurim, that tumah could go out from a tefach al tefach and the ceiling, that's only if the ceiling is under a roof, whereas you have two floors, and then the lower floor, in the ceiling, there's a tefach al tefach, and there's tumah under that ceiling, so then the tumah will go through the tefach al tefach into the upper floor, because there's a floor above this area. So in Mela, everything is under the oil, the upper oil, which is mitzdarf with the lower oil. Masha'enkin, if there's no ceiling at all, in other words, it's open to the sky, so then there's no tumah under an area which is open to the sky, because of the tumah in the bias. Now that is a vakert. If you have a tumah under this open area, under this hole in the roof, so that tumah is not going to extend into the house. That's the first halacha that the Rambam is going to say here. Perek Shishas, Aruba Shehi Be'emtza Tikras Habayis. You have it's called skylight. You have an opening in the roof. Bein Shehoye B'Pisech Tefach, Bein She'en B'Pisech Tefach. Regardless of how big that opening is. Regardless of how big the opening is. Because we'll learn that a Pisech Tefach, the tumah goes through, and by not Pisech Tefach, the tumah doesn't go through. But over here we're talking about if there's an opening that's to the sky. She'en B'Pisech Tefach, V'hoysa tumah tachas tikras habayis. And there was tumah under the roof, is connected aruba Torah. Sharehu Goli Laver. Since he's open, completely open, there's no roof over it. So since there's no roof over it, it has nothing to do with the oil. And therefore, no matter how minimal he is, that area which is connected, that opening, which is completely opening, and there's no roof over it, is Torah. Ushara bias tummy, the rest of the bias is tummy. The tummy goes around over into the entire bias, extends under the entire oil, around that hole, but not in that area where there's the hole. Now there is a vakert. If the tumah was only again under that opening, is kol habayis Torah. That's the first halach. So the first halach is that the fact that there's tumah in the bias is not going to extend any tumah connected to aruba, and al derezeh, the tumah that's connected to aruba, regardless of size, is not going to extend any tumah into the bias. Now the Ram continues, hoysa mixas hatumah tachas hatikra, umiktzasa tachas aruba. If you have a piece of tumah, let's say a kezayis min hames, and part of this kezayis min hames is under the bias, and part of this kezayis min hames is under the aruba. Now the din is that b'klal, if you have a bias, and that bias, a part of a mitzvah min hames without an aruba, just coming from the outside, you have a bias, and part of the kezayis min hames is in the bias, so the bias is tummy. You don't need that the entire kezayis min hames should be in the bias to be mitami the bias. And al derech zeh, if you're mile, for example, over part of a kezayis min hames, you're also tummy. There's b'chlal, a kezayis min hames gives out tumas ale, but it doesn't have to be that there has to be the entire kezayis min hames under the ale, and al derech zeh, you don't have to be mile on top of the entire kezayis min hames in order to become tummy. So the pashtus advarim l'chura would sound that l'chura, it could be mitami both places. We'll soon see. Hoysa mixas hatum tachas hatikra, umiktzasa tachas haruba. Part of, let's say, this kezayis was under the bias, was under the roof, and miktzasa was tachas haruba. So the din is im hoysa ba'aruba pisech tefach. If this aruba, if this opening was a pisech tefach, so the din is habayis kuli tomei u'keneged kol haruba tomei. So both is tummy. Now it says over here, Keneged Kol Aruba, because a Mishnah, and Al Deres of the Ravid, fixed that it should say Keneged Kol Atuma Tummy, not Keneged Kol Aruba Tummy. It means Keneged Kol Atuma Tummy, which basically means that L'chura the Pashta Din, that since part of the Tumah, so part of this, let's say, Kezayis Menames, is under the bias, so the bias is tummy, and since part of it is under the aruba, so if a person is mile over that part, Menames, which is over the aruba, it's also tummy. So that's L'chura Pashta Din. Ein ba Pesach Tefach, if there's no Pesach Tefach, there's the opening in the roof is not a Pesach Tefach. So this is like this is a Chiddush Dikadinesis, to the regular thing that we would understand. Im yesh betumah kedei sheteschalik, if there's enough of this tumah, let's say tumah menames, let's say there's two kezesim, that there's enough of the tumah menames that it's enough to divide it, the imotz, it'll come out kishir tachas hatikra. So there's a kezayis under the tikra, and also kishir tachas haruba. So then it's akel tummy. Then you under the bayis of the chavada tummy, and also under the tikra is tummy, which means if a person is mile over the kezayis menames, which is under the tikra, and over there you don't have to be a mile over the entire kezayis. As long as there's a kezayis menames under this tikra, so then if you're mile on part of it, so then you're tummy. That's v'im lav. But if there's not enough to divide that there should be a kezayis sai under the tikra and sai under the aruba, so then the din is habayis tummy. The habayis is tummy, which again is pashut. U'keneged aruba tar. But here there's a chidush that keneged aruba tar, which means even though the churid is a part of the kezayis menames that you're being mile on, but since it's talking about that it's less, that the opening is less than a pesach tefach, and there's not enough mess in order to be a kezayis, say under the tikra and say under the aruba. So over here, that part which is sticking out under the aruba is not matar. It's like a chidush dikadin. Whereas over here, we're not saying that there's a din of normally we say tumah because v'yeredus, regardless if it's only a part of a tumah. But over here, ki'ilu, that since this kezayah, this part of the mess, which is sticking out under the aruba, and the aruba is the chapakas mitevach al tevach, it's ki'ilu like this part of the mess is like under the bias. It becomes like bottled to the bias. It's like since this area is like a very small area, it's less than tefach al tefach, and the part that's there is less than a kezayis. So the din is, you have to understand the din, but that's the halacha. That's halacha. It's halacha. I mean, ateiredik halacha because it's going lekula keneged aruba tor. So we're saying that you don't say on this tumah because v'oila and memela keneged aruba tor. Like a chiddush again. Normally the din is when you mile on part of a kezayis, you always tummy. Here we're saying that if you have a kezayis, and that kezayis is partially under the bias, and partially under the aruba, and that aruba is pakis mitefach al tefach, so it's ki'ilu that kezayis, that entire kezayis is under the bias and not under the aruba, and therefore we don't say tumah because va'ila, because we're, the Reb Chaim Sefer also talks about this din to understand the havan of this din. But the pale, that's the din. The havan. The din is we're saying that ki'ilu, this part, which is under the aruba, which is pakis mitefach al tefach, since it's an insignificant part, and also the hole on top is also a pakis mitefach al tefach, so therefore we transfer this ki'ilu pakis mikazayis, and its ki'ilu is under the bias and not under the aruba. Because if the aruba is a tefach al tefach, so you can't, so it's not, so this area is not insignificant. It doesn't become bottled to the bias. The area in itself is choshev. If the davar hamatam is in itself a kezayis, so the davar hamatam is choshev. So again, it's not transferred. But say the davar hamatam is less than a kezayis because there's no kezayis under the aruba, and al derech that the aruba is less than the tefach al tefach. So b'chi agavni you say that ki'ilu this pakis kezayis is in the bias, and this pakis kezayis you don't say is because veil. That's the halach. Now hoya baruba pisechta. Now it's a nudin. Hoya baruba pisech tefach. There was a pisech tefach in the aruba, and v'nosen adam ragli milmaylo al aruba, and this person puts his foot on the aruba and he covers this tefach al tefach. So now is nasa akel eyel echad. So the entire ceiling becomes one oil, because it's made up of the ceiling plus this foot which is covering this hole. Memelo ben shoysa tumatachas atikra bulvad. A tachas aruba bulvad hakel tummy. That's pashut. So since you have an entire covering, everything is covered, there's no holes. So the entire area is tummy. If the tumah was, let's say, under the area where the foot is, so the entire bias is tummy, and and al derech if the tumah was under the bias, so also under the foot is also tummy because it's an extension of the oil. Habayis says the ben shoyis hatumah tachas hatikra belvad, etachas haruba belvad hakel tummy. Habayis side the bias is tummy, umasher keneged haruba it's also tummy, and also for ha'adam she'irav is hatumah also tummy. Now this person that's standing on top of this roof, and he's making up the roof, he's also tummy. Because he's part of this oil on the tumah. Whereas there's a tefach al tefach that he is the oil. So since he's the oil al tumah, so Mamela is being ma'il al tumah, so therefore he's tummy. So that's pashut. So if you have a roof with an aruba of a tefach al tefach, and a person puts his foot over this roof, so everything in the house is tummy, regardless side under the bias and side under the aruba, and he's also tummy because he is a roof over the tumah. Pashut. Now, however, ein ba'aruba pisech tefach. If in the aruba there was no pisech tefach, and now v'hoisa hatuma tachas hatikra, and there's tuma tachas hatikra, and the pashtus, this tuma is not going to go under the aruba, even though the aruba is pakas mitefach, but like we learned that lepela doesn't extend under the aruba. Now this person went ahead and he's put his foot over this aruba. Now, by putting his foot over this aruba, he's causing that the tumah should go under the aruba because his foot is an extension of that oil. But on the other hand, we're talking about a hole which is less than tefach al tefach. So that's the zeh shenos ragel memayla tor. So the person that puts his foot on memayla is tor, even though he's causing that under his foot the tumah should extend from the entire bias also under the aruba, which is really under his foot. But the tumah is not going to go out through an area which is pakas mitefach al tefach, and the fact that his foot became a chelik of the general oil of the house, and therefore it extends the tumah also under the aruba, but lepel he doesn't have a din of an oil, because lepel there's no area which is a tefach al tefach over there. So since lepel he doesn't have a din of an oil, the tumah doesn't go up through this pakas mitefach al tefach. Therefore, he's not tummy. That's the chiddush over here. Whereas if we're talking about a tefach al tefach, he's always tummy. Masha'inkin ein baruba pisech tefach, v'hoisa hatuma tachas hatikra. So the din is zeh shenosen raglim mulmayla tor. Why? She'ein tumah yetzis lemipachas mitefach. The tumah is not going to go up through that hole. And memela his lechura also becoming an oil on the tumah. The answer is no. He's not really becoming an oil, a real oil, because he's only becoming an extension of the general oil, and he's only a pachas mitefach. However, hoisa tumah tachas aruba, that's talking about if the tumah was under the bias. However, ima tumah hoisa tachas aruba, the tumah wasn't under the bias. So we have a tumah tachas aruba. So let's again, we have a roof that has an aruba over it, and that aruba is a pachas mitefach al tefach, and the tumah now is under that aruba. So it depends. Im tumah kodmas raglei, if before he put his foot there was tumah under that aruba. So basically he went ahead, and before he actually got his foot to become part of the roof, he became tummy by his foot being over this tumah. Whereas the foot goes over the tumah, and now it becomes part of the roof. So since the tumah was there already before he put his foot there, so as soon as he put part of his foot there, so as long as he extended something over this tumah, he becomes already tummy. Im tumah kodmas ragli is tummy shayel ala tumah, and lepel when you mile ala tumah, the tumah goes through even by a pakas mitefach. There's this din that a pakas mitefach al tefach, the tumah doesn't go through. It means the tumah that's going in the oil doesn't go through an area which is pakas mitefach al tefach. But if there's the tumah directly below the person, as we learned before, when the tumah is directly below and there's an area, an aruba, which is pakas mitefach al tefach on top, and you're being mile on it, you're befeidish tumah. So male over here, you also tummy. However, in ragla kodmas hatumah, if a person you have a house, a roof, and that roof has an aruba, which is a pakas mitefach al tefach, and then he went ahead and put his foot over it. So the violet is nothing happened. So what do we have? We have a roof with an area a hole which is pakas mitefach al tefach, and is being covered by his foot. Now comes along tumah, and that tumah is under that hole. So since now that hole is already considered closed, so it's considered part of the oil, and on the other end, we don't call him a ma'il ala tuma, because lepel, we consider him an extension of the oil, not that he's being ma'il ala tuma, because it's a pax mitafach al tefach, and on the other end, since it's pax mitafach al tefach, the tumah doesn't go through, so therefore it remains stored. Im ragle kadmis atuma is tor, shari ragle miktus oil. He's not being ma'il ala tuma. His foot became part of the oil, and vein tumah yetzisli. Tumah is not going to go out of this oil because a tumah doesn't go out of an oil if it's a pax mitafach al tefach. If it's a pax mitafach al tefach. So that's these dinim. So the state of the dinim is that under a tikra is nachabal, under an opening. So there's no extension of the oil to under the opening. There's no extension to the oil of under the opening. And then there was a din. What happens if it's less than a kezayis? If we only have one kezayis, difference if it's a tefach al tefach, and when the opening is a tefach al tefach, so it always extends to both side into the house, and it's into partially into the house, and partially under the aruba. So then both of them are tamei. If it's a pax mitefach al tefach, so it depends. If there's enough kezayis for both, so then both are tamei under the house and under the aruba. If there's only one tefach, there's only one kezayis, and both are sharing it, so to speak, the house and under the aruba. So then it's keilu like the whole kezayis is under the house. That was this din. Now we had the din with nos and ragli. It depends the difference. So again, if there's a tefach al tefach, so nos and ragli is always tamei. But if it's pakas mitefach al tefach, so if it's tachas habayis, or it's even tachas or aruba, but the tumah came after he put the foot, so then he'll be before he put the foot, so that he'll be tamei. Mashain came if it's tachas, if it's a pakas mitefach al tefach, and it's tachas habayis, or it's even tachas ha'aruba, but it came there after he put his foot, so then it'll be torah. Halacha beis. Hoya kizayis min hames b'fi ha'erev. There's an erev that's holding a kizayis min hames. V'heil al gabi aruba, and then he went ahead and landed on top of this aruba. Achenimtze kizayis ba'avar aruba. So you have an aruba, and this kizayis of the mes is like closing up this aruba. That is the extension of the oil. The kizayis min hames becomes the extension of the oil, which is covering the opening of this aruba. Is afal pishaim ba pisach tefach, even though there's no pisach tefach, is nevertheless habayis tomei. And the reason for it is because since there's a kizayis min hames, and that's covering that, that's into that aruba, so therefore the kizayis min hames is being mile on the area which is under the kizayis min hames. So there's tumah going into this area which is under this kizayis min hames. Now the pale, this entire area is one oil because this kizayis min hames is covering up and becoming an extension to the entire oil. So memela, the entire bias becomes tummy. So in other words, B'kitzur, you have a house, and that house, let's say, has a hole, and that hole is being closed with a kizayis min hames. So now you have an entire house, an entire covering, and part of that covering is a kizayis min hames. So even though the kizayis min hames is less than a tefach al tefach, but lepel, the kizayis min hames is bringing tumah into the house because it's being miled into that area of the house, and lepel, that tumah is spreading into the entire house because lepel, it's one oil because there's no separation. That kizayis min hames is filling up the whole. Halacha gimel. Bayis, if you have a house, and va'aruba be'emtza tikras habayis, and then you have a aruba, an opening in the ceiling of the house, and then va'ali al gaba, and on top of this house you have an upper floor, again another floor, and then va'aruba acheres yesh be'emtza tikras habayis, and then there's another aruba, there's another opening under this be'emtza tikras aliyah in the middle of the ceiling over the upper floor. And the arubas are exactly against each other. So you have very simple. You have two floors, and you have a hole in the ceiling of the downstairs floor, and then you have a ceiling you have a hole in the ceiling of the upstairs floor, and those holes are exactly against each other. Bayis, v'aruba be'emtza tikras habayis, and then v'aliyah al gaba, v'aruba acheres yesh be'emtza tikras aliyah. And v'haruba is muchavan izu l'mayla mizu. Is ben sheyesh b'aruba is pisach tefach, ben she'en ben pisach tefach. So it's the same thing like the beginning of halacha aleph. V'tumah bebayis, if there's tumah bebayis, it's keneged arubis tor. V'ashar tummy, the bias is tummy, but keneged arubis is tummy. When it says ashar tummy, it means the rest of the bias is not the aliyah is not going to become tummy. The aliyah is not going to become tummy, but the arubis will become tummy. And hoysa tumah keneged arubis, if there was tumah keneged arubis, is a bias fully tor, and only keneged arubis is tummy. That's a din poshut. Hoyu barubis pisech tefach. Now that we're talking a new case. So the case before was Pasha. It's a Pasha case. It makes no difference if it's 2 arubas, 1 aruba. The Mitzvah says that Keneged Aruba, since there's no Tumah, is Tor, and Keneged Aruba. It doesn't extend from Keneged Arubas to the Bayis, not from the Bayis, Keneged Arubas. Now we're talking about a case, Hoysu Tumah Keneged Arubas. Hoyu Barubis Pesach Tefach. In the Arubas there was a Pesach Tefach. Vahatuma, and the Tumah was bein Tachas Tikras Abayis, bein Neged Arubas. And v'nosim dover shu mekabel tuma, and he went ahead and put a dover shu mekabel tuma, bein lemayla me'arubas habayis, bein lemayla me'arubas aliyah. So in that case, hakil tomei, she'ein dover tomei chetzes. Now we have a rule that ein dover tomei chetzes, which means that if you have tuma on something that's tomei over it's being mile on a mess. So normally oil Sayed brings the tumah under the oil, and Sayed causes that the tumah shouldn't go through the oil. Mashaik and the dover tameh causes that the tumah should spread under the oil, but it doesn't cause that the tumah should stop going above the oil. So Memela over here we're saying as if you have the moshel, a bayis and aliyah, and you have those 2 arubas, and now you went ahead and covered the aruba with a dover tameh, So the davar tummy causes that this tumah should spread, but it doesn't cause that the tumah should be chaytzitz. So since it doesn't cause that the tumah should be chaytzitz, so therefore the tumah goes up, and since it's a pisach tefach, there's a pisach tefach over here. So since there's a pisach tefach, the tumah goes up. The tumah is because ve'ela because ve'eres. That's this din. That's the yisod of this din. So let's go again through the case. You have a bayis and aliyah. You have 2 arubis. One in the bias and one in the aliyah, and they're connected each other. So, for example, if you have, tumah bebayis under the tikras habayis, and then you're going to go ahead and put something that's a covering over the aruba of the aliyah, and that covering which is over the aruba of the aliyah is a davar which is mekabel tumah. So the din is going to be once you have a tumah over the opening of the aliyah. So therefore, it has a din ki'ilu, the area under in the bias also has a covering, because the covering an oil doesn't have to be that they're all on the same level. You can have an oil above. In other words, you can have an oil, let's see, and that area has a hole, and then you have the covering for that hole on a higher area. So the covering over the aruba of the aliyah serves also as an oil for the bias. So now the bias has a complete oil. The oil of the bias is complete. The oil of the bias is complete. So the tumah in the bias spreads in the entire bias. Now once the tumah spreads in the entire bias, so the pale, since there's an opening between the bias and the aliyah, which is pisech tefach, so it also spreads into the aliyah. That's pashut. Why shouldn't it spread into the aliyah? There's a pisech tefach between the bias and the aliyah, so it goes up into the aliyah. And once it's in the aliyah, so it also goes up over that covering over the aruba and the aliyah, because that covering is a davar hamakabel tumah. So then everything is verstandig. Question is, what happens if you take a davar hamakabel tumah and you put it under the aruba of the bias? Notice you have something that's matami under the tikras habayis. Now you take something that's makabel tumah and you put it over the opening of the bias. So the chura, good. So lepel under the bias is completely tummy. Under the bias is completely tummy. And since the tumah is also the davar which is covering that opening is a davar hamakabel tumah, so the tumah is going to go up. But where is it going to go up? The chura is going to go up keneged the aruba, because that's where the opening is. And lepel, since it goes up keneged aruba, the chura should go up keneged the other aruba, which is in the aliyah, and then l'chura it should go up because va'ela. But how does it spread into the aliyah? Lepel, the Rambam is saying that it spreads into the aliyah as well. Not only that's this halach here. Let's read the halach again. Hoyse tumah connect. Hoyu barubis piseh tefach. V'hatuma ben tachas tikas habayis ben keneged arubis. and v'nosan davar shemekabel tuma bein l'mayla me'arubas habayis, bein l'mayla me'arubas aliyah. So then hakil tomik she'ein davar t'chetzes. Over here you need to understand, if he put the davar hamekabel tuma connected the arubas habayis, so how does the aliyah become tomik? So it's like a dvar chiddush, that since ein davar tomik chetzes, so the tum is going up, and since the tum is going up, it's ki'ilu, this covering over the tikras habayis is going up over the tikras aliyah. That's what it says. I don't understand the havanas advarim, but it's halacha. It's ki'ilu. How does this covering, which is over the arubas habayis, become a covering over the arubas aliyah? That's what is brought down. It's brought down that that's the pshat, that since we're dealing with a davar hamekabel tuma, so memela the tuma goes through this area, this covering, which is this covering, and memela's kilo, the covering is on top of the aliyah. Once the covering is on top of the aliyah, so then it's understandable that the tumah spreads in the aliyah as well. Now, nosen davar she'ein, that's talking about when you put a davar she'ein mekabel tumah. However, nosen davar she'ein mekabel tumah al arubas habayis. If you put it on top of arubas habayis, so then it's at bayis tumah v'aliyah teira. That's pashut, because lepel in the bayis there's tumah, and lepel the tumah spreads under the entire bayis. But lepel it doesn't go through because there's a covering, and memela the oil is mafsik b'fnei tumah. However, nosni al arubas aliyah, if you put it on top of the arubas aliyah, so now so lepel there's still a hole. There's a hole in between the bayis the aliyah, the arubas habayis. So memela habayis v'aliyah tmeim, everything is tummy. Because since we're dealing with a covering which is not mekabel tumah, so memela it's chaytzit. So memela the tumah is only contained within the bayis and the aliyah, and it doesn't go beyond the aliyah. This is all talking about when we're having between these holes, these arubis in the aliyah and in the bayis were both a piseach tefach. The issue was the covering something was mekabel tumah, or the covering something that wasn't mekabel tumah. Now he's talking about ein barubis piseach tefach. What happens if there's not a piseach tefach? And v'hatuma tachas tikras habayis, and there's tuma tachas tikras habayis. V'noser bein davar hamekabel tuma, bein davar she'ein mekabel tuma, bein al arubis habayis, bein al arubis aliyah. So ein tumi al habayis. Why? Because there's tuma in the bayis. There's tuma in the bayis. Now this bayis has an oil over it, so the entire oil is, so the bayis is completely tummy. But lepel, now you want that tumah should go up. That tumah can't go up because there's a pachas mepiseach tefach. In other words, even though we learned before that a davar she'eini mekabel tumah, is not chaytzis b'fnei tumah. Correct. In other words, if normally the tumah would go up, and the reason why it's not going up is because of this oil, and this oil is a davar she'eini mekabel tumah, it's shemekabel tumah, so it's not chaytzis b'fnei tumah. But over here the tumah can't go up, because lepel the opening, the aruba, which is b'tech habayis, tech tikras habayis, is a pachas mitefach al tefach. So memela, since it can't go up because it's pachas mitefach al tefach, memela stays there. The fact that it's being covered and causing the extension of the tumah under this area, which is a pachas mitefach al tefach, is being done by a davar hamekabel tumah, is not going to cause that the tumah should be able to go through this hole, because sof kol sof, the hole is a pachas mitefach al tefach. That's talking about if the tumah was bebayis. Now, hoysla tumah keneged arubis. If the tumah was keneged arubis, so be'etzema over here is going up not mitzad the din that the tumah which is in the oil is going up, but rather over here it's going up because it's keneged arubis, and memela it could go out the din of you're being ma'il ala tumah. And as we learned before, we mentioned before, that when something is being ma'il ala tumah, the fact that it's a pachas mitefach al tefach is irrelevant. Hoysa tumah keneged arubis v'nosim davar shu mekabel tumah bein lemailon bein lemata. So then habayis v'aliyah tmeim. Over here the bayis and aliyah tmeim sharei irvis hatumah, because he was irvis hatumah. So over here you also have to come on to the word before that even you have to understand it, that even if this covering is on the bayis mulmata. But since we're talking about a davar hamekabel tumah, so it's kilo, the covering is on top of the aliyah, which is hard to understand. But that's what he's saying over here. In other words, if you have tumah keneged, if you have the tumah keneged haruba, so that tumah be'emes is bikaz ve'ela. That's what this tumah would do. Now you put a covering over it. Now since that covering is a davar hamekabel tumah, so that covering, which is a davar hamekabel tumah, is not going to stop the tumah from going up. It's not going to stop the tumah from going up from being Bikaz Va'ela through a Dover, which is a Dover HaMakabel Tumah. So it's still going to be Bikaz Va'ela. So we understand why it's Bikaz Va'ela, but we still don't understand. And we also understand why, let's say, if you have a covering, which is over the low. If you have a covering over the higher one, over the aliyah, so everything would become tummy because it's Bikaz Va'ela, and lepel now it's under an area which is completely roof. So the tumah spreads. The tumah spreads. Al derech zeh, if you have the davar hamakabel tumah over the opening of the bias, we understand why the entire bias is tummy. But over here we're saying that the entire aliyah is also tummy. You also have to come onto that same din, which is very hard to understand. That when you have a davar, when we have a davar hamakabel tumah over the tikras habayis, so we give it a din as if that davar hamakabel tumah is over the tikras aliyah. Memela, the entire bias and the aliyah stomach. That's what he's saying. That's what he's saying. Now, again, hoisa tuma keneged arubis, and then v'nosen davar shemekabel tuma bein lemayla bein lematon. So then abayis v'aliyah tumah. Then the entire bias and aliyah become tumah. Shari irivas atuma. However, nosen davar she'eni mekabel tuma. If he puts something that's not mekabel tuma bein lemayla bein lematon, so then any tumah ela habayis. So then it's only tummy the bias. In other words, even though lepel he put that covering on top of the aliyah. So let's again, you have one aruba against another aruba, and you have the tumah keneged aruba. So that tumah normally is being oila, but lepel there's a roof over it. So now that roof, we say kilo, that roof is over the bias because lepel the roof is over the aliyah and over the bias. So since you have a roof over the bias, so the entire bias is tummy. But now when that tumah wants to go out from the bias into the aliyah, it can't go out through the bias in the aliyah because it's a paks mitavach al tefach. So since it's a paks mitavach al tefach, so therefore that blocks the tumah from going out. That blocks the tumah from going out. That blocks the tumah from going out. Yeah. So before we were learning a din when it was a tefach al tefach. Masha'enken, when it's a nasun davar she'enim mekabel tumah, bein lemayla, bein lematon, any tummy ela bias. Only the bias is tummy. That's it. Now he says v'chol elu adinim is ba'is aruba. That's only when talking about when you made an aruba and therefore the share is a tefach al tefach. Aval tikra shenifchas me'alah. But if the whole happened by itself, it's not you made the whole, but the whole happened by itself. So then is shiur and malayagrif. Then the share is a malayagrif, which is like a reish gadol. Shaladam kamei shabiyan. The Edom halacha gimel also you have to understand. In other words, we're talking about, let's go through the din again. A person has two arubas, and we're dealing with, let's say, the area that's pachas mitefach al tefach. The aruba is pachas mitefach al tefach. Now you have tumah keneged aruba, so the tumah is bikaz va'ela, and therefore it goes through, even though it's an area which is pachas mitefach al tefach. That's understandable, and it doesn't spread into the house. Now you put a davar she'eni mekabel tumah, you put it on top of the aliyah. You put it on top of the aliyah. So now that causes that tumah, which was originally bikaz va'ila, so now that tumah, since it's tachas a tikra, because there's a covering over even the aliyah, so that causes that the tumah should spread into the entire house, the entire lower house. But l'chura, the tumah is still here in an eifon of being bikaz va'ila. It's keneged aruba. So since it's keneged aruba, so why shouldn't the tumah also spread into the aliyah? So now we're saying no, that's a chidush. Whereas once this tumah, which is in the bias, which is keneged aruba, which normally would be bikaz va'ila, so now because of that covering which is over the roof, which is causing that it should be chilu, there's a covering in the bias. If there would be a covering but pale in the bias, I understand. So that covering but pale in the bias stops the bikaz va'ila. But over here, there's no covering but pale in the bias. There's a din covering in the bias. In other words, it causes that it should be able to spread the tumah into the bias. But lepel, there is a hole there. And lepel, lechura, the tumah is right under that hole. So we say no. But since that hole, there's a din covering on that hole, so therefore it causes that this hole should no longer have a din of a hole. So memela, so then there's no tumah because vela. The tumah can be because vela because the tumah doesn't go through, even though there's no actual opening over there. I mean, there's no actual covering over there. But since it's a pachs mitafach al tafach, so the fact that it's the tumah is connected the whole becomes irrelevant. Whereas even though before the tumah was connected, the whole the tumah was being because ve'ela. Now the tumah got a din that it spreads into the entire house because of the din oil which is on the aliyah. But nevertheless, we're saying that lepel, since it becomes a din oil like bitzad the aliyah, so therefore now it's no longer the din of tumah because ve'ela, and since al din oil, it's not going to be oil because it's a pach. Okay, halacha dalet. Hapiseches hamaziva. Again, someone opens the ceiling, or the maziva is the plaster that was on top of the ceiling. So in other words, there was beams, and on top of that there was plaster, and on top of that there was an upper floor. Now a person goes ahead and opens the plaster which is on the beams. So therefore, there's like a little hole in between the upper floor and the lower floor. So now there's an opening in this roof. In order for the foot of the leg of the bed to be able to go in. Vice versa, brought down that in order for the leg to have more support and to be firm, so you had a hole in the ceiling, and that held the leg tight. So lapel the leg was seen. You could see the leg from the bottom floor. You could see the leg of the upper floor, which is going into the ceiling. This leg was closing up this aruba. In other words, you had an opening in the ceiling, and this leg was opening was closing up that opening. If that opening had a pisech tefach, so the leg also was a pisech tefach, was closing that opening, and the tumah bebayis, and there's tumah bebayis afaliyat meir, and that part, that's the din pashut. Why? She'ein keli amakabel tumah chaytzit. So notice be'etzem there is a hole in the ceiling. So meila lechura the tumah should be because ve'ela the tumah should go through this opening, which is a pisech tefach. Elamai, this pisech tefach is being covered by this regel of the bed. Good, but the regel of the bed is the chazach, which is mekabel tumah. So since it's mekabel tumah, so that can prevent the tumah from going through this aruba into the upper floor. However, ein ba pisech tefach, if there's no pisech tefach, is ain't no aliyah teira. The aliyah is teira because it doesn't have where to go through. But lapel, since this regel is already sticking in to the hole which is over the tumah, so therefore, and it's sticking into the hole which is over the tumah, so then it has a din like kelim amaylim. It has a din like kelim amaylim. Now we have to understand, before we learn l'mashal an adam, which is on top of a hole, which is a pachas mipesech tafach, he doesn't have a din of an oil hamayil. He doesn't have a din of an oil hamayil. And over here we're saying that the regel, which is lamata, is tmeim kikelim amaylim, even though lepel, this hole, is a pachas mitafach. But lepel, the regel is tummy. Nifchesa, this is all talking about if you hapisech is amaziva. So then the shear is pisech tefach. However, nifchesa amaziva meila, if the maziva opened by itself, and you didn't go ahead and open the maziva, so then it's shiurim leyagrif, then it's a larger shear that has to be leyagrif, the size of a fist, but not the stama fist of that very large person, ben batiach, which his fist is the size of a normal head, kimei shabiyar. Halacha hey. Aruba shebetech tikers habayis. You have an opening again in the ceiling, and ukedera munachas al aretz. You have a pot that's made out of a klicheres that's lying on the ground. Umuchuven is connected aruba. The pot is directly under this opening in the ceiling, and the size of this pot is shemtala betzimsum imtala teitzim betzimsum ba'aruba. The size of the pot is not less than the size of the aruba. It's at least as big that if it'll go up, it'll go out. It'll just make it out of the aruba. It'll fill up the entire aruba. If it's bigger than that, it's even better. I mean, it's not even better. It's the same thing. But it means to say that it's not less. As we'll soon behemshech, that there's a case where it's less. Mashenkin over here, we're talking about there's a ceiling, there's a hole in the ceiling, and there's a pot under the hole, and that pot is the size of the hole, is the full size of the hole. So if you'll pick up the pot will go, just barely make it out of the aruba, exactly make it. Shemtala teitzi betzimtzum in aruba. And v'hoisu tuma tachas hagdera. And there was tuma lying under the gdera, ritzutza beinoa beinoaretz. So there was no oil over there. So again, we learned right in the beginning of the Perek, that if anything is connected, the opening in the ceiling, So that tumah only goes up; it doesn't spread into the oil. So Aldera is over here. The fact that lepel there's a kedera there and it's lying under the kedera doesn't make a difference because lepel it's tumah ritzutza. The kedera doesn't have a din of an oil, so therefore it's just like tumah lying there. And the tumah is lying keneged the aruba, so therefore there's only tumah because of oil, and that's it. That's what he's saying. So the mela is nachamol. V'hoisu tumah tachas hagdera ritzutza b'no v'in haaretz. Either way, it's not under an oil, so the din is tumah because of oil, because of yeredes. And vein tumah oil connected, only connected of the aruba is tumah, or connected the tumah is tumah, really. The bias kulik tar, the bias is tar. Now, however, hoisa gdera goveya minaretz tefach. The gdera was larger, was raised from the ground a tefach. And now the tumah tachteh, and this tumah under this gedera. Now this gedera, if it's raised above the ground, the tefach, so there's an oil, and it's surrounded by the oil of the house. So basically, the two oil holim mix. It's like really one oil because there's no separation between the gedera and the house, as we said before. That the gedera fills the entire hole, the entire laruba. So memela it goes together. So memela hoysa gedera geveyim and oretz tefach. And the tumah tachteh, the tumah is under this kedera. A tachas tikkur zabayis, or it's under the roof. So the din is habayis kuli tumah, v'tachas tikkur tumah. Because the pale, since there's a el tumah, and the two oiholim merge, sharehu oil. They're an oil. But that's only under the kedera and in the house. Avul techa kedera v'gabator. But inside the kedera and on top of the kedera store, she'en kli cheres matamim megabe. So if the kli cheres would have become tamei, so then the tumah would have been oil as well, because the klicheres as a keli, which is tamei, wouldn't have been able to be chaytzis from the tumah. But since the klicheres is the chnam matamim megabe, so the fact that this tumah under the klicheres doesn't make it tamei, so therefore this tumah which is under the klicheres doesn't extend to the top of the klicheres. Baharei aver akdeira goli lavire, so the aver akdeira is goli lavire, so therefore moyakeli b'teicha ilamay al gabe tor. And aldera zehoisu tumah b'teicha al gaba habayis kulitor. So in other words, what's going on top of the gdera has no effect to what's going on in the gdera out in the house. No, even though the house is tamei, under the gdera is tamei, but lepel on top of the gdera is tor, in the gdera is tor, on top of the gdera is tor, everything is tor. And aldera zeh would be fakert if there would be tumah on top of this gdera. So that tumah on top of the gdera would be like the tumah under the arubas habayis, which goes up. But it doesn't extend. It doesn't extend to the house. It doesn't extend under the gedera. It's a separate entity. Is nachmal hoy kela b'teicha elamaylo gabetor hoysa tumah b'teicha, which tumah was in the gedera eyal gaba, is abayis tor sharei hatuma keneged aruba bulvat, because the tumah is keneged aruba bulvat. Over here you need beer the lechura, since the gedera, even though it's takanam makabel tumah, because not makabel tumah megaba, but it's a keli. It's a keli. We have a din that a keli is not chaytzis b'fnei atumas. You have to understand why this keli, this kedera, is not considered like a keli, which is any chaytzis b'fnei atumah, and it's connected because the kedera has walls, and those walls are considered an extension of the walls of the house, and therefore it has a din of a bias. There's kama pratim. But the Allah, this is the Allah. The Allah is lepel that the tumah is not oila from under the gedera to on top of the gedera, and al derech if there's tumah on top of the gedera, it wouldn't be yered to the bottom of the gedera and not extend to the rest of the house. That's the nazar. This thing we're talking about if the aruba and the gedera, the gedera fills up the entire aruba, so therefore whatever happens under the aruba extends into the house. Whatever happens in the house extends under the aruba because they're next to each other. So these two oiholim merge. Now, hoisa gedera tachas aruba. What happens if you have a gedera under aruba? V'ha'aruba gedolim in a gedera. The opening of the ceiling is larger than the gedera. Shem tala gedera v'teitzim in aruba. If you're going to want to take this gedera out of the aruba, nimtza b'no ben sifsi aruba piseh tefach. So in other words, there's a tefach radius, so to speak, between the gedera and the aruba. So you have a big large hole, and then you have a gedera, and if you put the gedera up, there'll always be a tefach between the gedera and the bais. There'll always be a tefach between the Kedera and the Bayis. That's how it's situated. Is Afal Pi knows the whole of the Kedera is a tefach shorter. We'll put it this way: it's 2 tefachim shorter in diameter than the diameter of the aruba. That's the pashtus, the dvar. We're talking about you have an aruba, which is the diameter of the aruba is 2 tefachim longer than the diameter of the Kedera. Is Afal Pi Sha Kedera Gevei Tefach, even though the Kedera is Gevei Tefach, and V'tumah B'teichi Al Gabi Al Tachteh, is a bias tor. The bias is tor. In other words, the tumah which is under the Kedera won't extend and merge with the oil of the bias because there's a tefach between the oil of the Kedera and the oil of the bias. That's this din. Now, you really have to understand, because l'chura we know that whenever there's a separation between 2 oilim, even if it's a very minimal separation, so l'chura also the 2 oilim don't merge. Why do we need that there should be a tefach between the Kedera and the Arubas Haba, and in other words, there should be such a large opening between the Kedera and the oil in order for the oil under the Kedera and the oil of the house not to merge. L'chura, as long as there's a separation, even if it's a very minimalistic separation, it should also have a din of a separation. So on that, the Ram Mara brings from the Chasdei David on the Tisefta, the Psachidush, that since it's surrounding the thing from all sides, so therefore over here, even though there would be some type of a separation, they would still merge the Eolim. Dafka, when there's a separation of a tefach, they don't merge. That's the halacha. The halacha is clear here. Then the Rambam continues. Hoysa hagedera munachas v'tzad atzkufes habayis. She'im ta'ala nimtzach mimenu piseach tefach lifnim min hamashkef. Now over here, we're talking, there's a mashkef. The mashkef is the part on top of the door, which is an extension of the oil of the house. In other words, the mashkef is an oil, and it extends from the oil of the house. Now, under this mashkef, there's a doorstep, which is the askufa. Now, that askufa is extending further outside of the house than the mashkef. In other words, the mashkef is covering part of the askufa, and then there's a part of the askufa which extends outside the mashkef. So when you say, Hoysa Gdeir Munachas, B'tzad Askufas Abayis, it means it was lying on the Askufas Abayis, it's called B'tzad Askufas Abayis, on the side of the Askufas Abayis, which means not on the part of the Askufas Abayis, which is under the mashkef. The pot, the Kedera was basically lying on the doorstep, which wasn't under the mashkef. However, part of it was going under the mashkef. That's what we say. Hoysa Kedera Munachas B'tzad Askufas Abayis, Shimtala, if the Kedera is going to go up, is nimtza mimeno piseach tefach lifnim min hamashkef. So, but lepel, most of the Gdeira is outside, but there is a piseach tefach of this Gdeira which is extending inside under the mashkef. Now, v'hoyso tumah ritzutza tachteh, a betechi al gaba, and that tumah which is ritzutza under the Gdeira, or in the Gdeira, or on top of the Gdeira, was not the part of the Gdeira which was under the mashkef. In other words, you have a Gdeira which is partially under the mashkef, and partially not under the mashkef. And you have tumah under that Gdeira, or on top of the Gdeira, or in the Gdeira. But lepel, that tumah is not under the mashkef. So then the din is tumah because ve'ela, because ve'eretz. That's pashut. Now, that's din we're talking about if the Gdeira is lying on the askuf. Now, hoysa gvoyim in the oretz tefach. If this Gdeira was higher than the oretz tefach, and the tumah tachteh oi babayis, so then the din is tachteh babayis tameh. So under the Gdeira and the Bayis is Tomei, Shakel oil echad, because it's all one oil. There's an extension rows. You have the Gdeira extends into under the mashkef, and the under the mashkef extends into the Bayis. So it all becomes one oil. So under the Gdeira is an oil, and that extends into the under the mashkef and under the Bayis. V'techa v'gabetor, v'techa v'gabetor. Now, this next halacha is hard to. This next halacha is the first one have a difficulty with next halacha. So until now, it's l'churas pashut. Hoysa hatuma b'teicha al gaba. If the tumah was inside the Gdeira or on top of the Gdeira. So now the question is which part of under the on top of under it. We're talking about under the mashkef or not under the mashkef. So l'chura before we spoke that if it's not under the mashkef, the tumah becomes ve'ela. Now we say, Hoysa Tumah V'Teichi Al Gaba is Abayis Tomei, why? mipnei shenigaz b'mashkev tefach. Because since the bias is nigaz b'mashkev tefach, so since the tumah knows the kedera could be nigaz b'mashkev tefach, so therefore it's keilu that it's in under the mashkev. V'chein tachtei atomei mipnei she'atumah yitzis l'tachtei min habayis. So again, it's hard to understand. What are we talking about over here? Are we talking about if there's tumah in the kedera, so the kedera becomes tumah. If the kedera becomes tumah, so the tumah goes under the kedera. If the tumah goes under the kedera, what do you need that the tumah should extend from the bias into under the kedera? The tumah should extend from teicha under the kedera. Shakel ayalechot. I'll call upon him. It's not really clear to me what the din is. Again, the Rambam is saying, Hoya atuma b'teicha al gaba. If the Rambam would have said, Hoya atuma b'teicha al gaba, so the bias is tummy. Why? Because lepel tachteh is tummy. Because batzim is tummy. Why not? Because the tumah goes under because the keli can't block the tumah from going down because it's makabel tumah, so it goes down. Once under the gdeir is tummy, so fakir, so that extends into the bias. I mean, it would be more understandable to understand that the tumah goes from the teicha gdeira to under the gdeira to in the bias. Over here he's saying the tumah is going into the bias and from in the bias under the gdeiras. Like hard to understand what's the avanas advar. Before I should ask about it. This is all talking about because part of the gdeira is inside the house under the mashkev b'pisech tefach. Oy shehoyse b'tzad mashkev v'tumah tachteh. So then, ein tomei el tachteh. So then it would be ein tomei el tachteh. Aval abayis tor. That would be the din before. In other words, when you have a kdeira and there's tumah tachteh, so then only tachteh is tomei. Mashenken over here, if you have the and also if there's no, if over here we're talking about that this tumah is b'teicha keli, and somewhere or another this tumah b'teicha keli is causing that since this keli partially is tachas hamashkiv a pisech tefach under the mashkiv, so that causes the tumah to go into the bias and from the bias under the keli. So some people want to say we're talking about with a keli that the part of the keli that contains the tumah is taka outside the under the mashkiv. But lepel, there's a part of the keli which is sticking out under the mashkiv, like the opening of the keli is going. It's not like a candle. It's like a ner Chanukah. You have a ner Chanukah. You have the area where you have the shemen, and then you have the area where you have the opening. So the opening is like under the mashkiv, and the area is outside the mashkiv. That's what the Rambam is talking about. I'll call upon him. It needs bitter, this halacha. Yeah. Well, let's just read this halacha one more time, just to get clear on the halacha. Hoysa tumah b'toicha. The tumah was in the keli. Eyal gabor on top of the keli. Is the din is abayis tomei. Mipnei b'shihinigaz b'mashkev tefach. How does the tumah go from the keli into the bias? The answer is because the keli is nigaz b'mashkev tefach. The shaila is the tumah under the mashkev. If the tumah is under the mashkev, so we don't need mipnei shenigaz mashkev tumah. So the pshat is the tumah is not under the mashkev, but somehow or another, because this keli is nigaz mashkev tefach, so therefore this tumah goes under the mashkev. And now he says v'chein tachtei tumah, and then under the keli also becomes tumah. Mipnei she'atumah yitzis tachtei min habayis. So somehow or another, the tumah is going from this keli into the bias, and then from the bias under the keli. Shakel eilech. That's only because nigaz mashkev tefach lefichach and lehoisa nigaz b'mashkev pisech tefach oy shehoisa b'tzad mashkev v'tumah tachteh. So and it's not b'teicha, but it's rather tumah tachteh, and therefore that tumah tachteh has nothing to do with the bias, because like we said before. So then ain't tumah el tachteh. There's only tumah al tachteh. Aval habayis tor. Halacha vav keres habayis v'aliyah she'ein aleim maziva. You have beams of a house. There's no ceiling. There's just the beams that make the house, side of the house, of the lower floor and side of the upper floor. There's the beams that are set up for the upper floor and for the lower floor. The beams are exactly above each other. So the beams of the upper floor are above the beams of the lower floor. And the opening of the upper floor is above the opening of the lower floor. And each beam has at least a tefach. Ubineim is also aver pisech tefach. There's an area which is a pisech tefach. And v'tuma tachas achas mem, and there's tuma under one of these beams. So the din is tachta bilvat tami. The only place that's tami is only under that particular beam where the tuma is. For hoisa tuma ben atachtenu l'yena. The tuma was, for example, on top of the beam of the lower floor, and it was between that. It was on top of that beam, so it was obviously between the beam of the upper floor and the beam of the lower floor. So the din is being shtein bilvat tami. Only that area is tami. Hoisa tuma al gabel yein. If the tuma was on top of the beam, the beam of the upper floor, the beam of the upper floor is connect the adler tami. So there's nothing on top of it. So there's no oil on top of it. So from there adler tami, mashenkin, it doesn't go down, because since we're dealing with an oil, it's an oil which is a tefach. So the oil is mafsid b'fnei atuma. Hoyu akeres ol yedis l'chuvonis keneged ha'aver shemin akeres l'tachtenis. The first case were that each kaira was on top of the other kaira. There's the keres ol yedis and the keres tachtenis. But over here we're dealing where there's the upper beams. So in other words, the space in between the upper beams, that's where the lower beam is. So the entire area is covered with beams. Some of it was covered with the upper beams, and some of it was covered with the lower beams. And the tuma tachas achas mem, and there's tuma under one of them. So the din is tachas kulan tummy. So under all of them is tummy. If there's tuma under any of the beams, so under all of the beams is tummy. Under all of the beams is tummy. Now hoisa tuma al gabi kairel yena. But if the tumah was on top of the upper beam, so there's no oil over it. There's no oil over it. Is keneged atuma adler kiyatami. So then keneged atuma adler kiyatami is again. If the tumah was under any of the beams, so then everything is tummy, because we considered one oil. Mashenkin, if the tumah was on top of the upper beam, so then only then there's no tumah going down into this house. So therefore, there's only tummy is only adler akiyah. Now you have to understand, what will be if there'll be tumah on top of one of the lower beams? You have on top of one of the lower beams. You know, if you have it on the bias, so we understand the entire bias is covered with tumah. Is tumah because we consider it one big oil. Mashenkin, if you have tumah, let's say on top of one of the lower beams, so l'chura on top of those lower beams, is l'chura. There's only this. There's space over it. It would be like tachas aruba. So l'chura, why would the tumah spread in the entire house? The Rambam really doesn't say clearly that if it's on top of. The Rambam says like this: Hoyu hakeres ol yein b'chuvonis keneged ha'aver shemin hakeres l'tachtenis. The tumah tachas achas mehem, who is under one of the kairis, is tachas kulan tummy. Now hoysa tumah al gabi keirel yena. So then keneged atuma adler akiyah tummy. Now what happens if it's hoya al gabi keira tachtena? So the pashtus advarim, if it was al gabi keira tachtena, it's also tummy, because somewhere or another the tumah spreads into the entire house. I mean, this is also connected to the din that we consider it. Kilo, it's a special din of chavut rami that we go ahead and consider it kilo, like the beams on top is in between the beams on the bottom, and that's only taka when it's an exact. Whereas the Rambam is saying up at Sir, when we're having a tefach, and there's a space of a tefach in between. What's the negay? The space of a tefach in between. What's the negay is that they should be able to fill up. And those this din that we say that is ki'ilu considered completely covered with an oil, that's only when they're taka exact measurements, and therefore when you fill it up, it becomes ki'ilu completely covered in an oil. The kopar still needs beer. I mean, the Rambam brings that again from that same Chazdei David, that since things are surrounding it, the entire oil is surrounding it, so therefore it's considered part of the oil. A kopar needs beer. But lepel, the din is clearly that if you have the upper beams and the lower beams, and the upper beams are above the area, the space in between the lower beams, and the lower beams, So the din is that if the tum is anywhere in the house, so the entire house is tummy. But if the tum is on top of the upper beams, so then the tum doesn't extend into the house. It's only because va'ila. That's talking about if the kairis have a tefach. However, in the kairis pisech tefach, if those kairis don't have a tefach, and even though lepel, if you're going to make this cheshbon of putting together the beams, there's going to be a tefach. But lepel, if each kair doesn't have a tefach, ein be kairis pisech tefach. Ben shoyu mechuvan is al gabizu, ben shoyu al yenis kedeged avra tachtenis, regardless. And v'hoiset atuma tachteim, ebineim al gabeim. So there's always tumah because ve'ela because v'yeredus. So in other words, you can't create an oil with a bunch of beams that each one is less than a pesach tefach. Ve'ena metama ela keneged bulvad. Shekol tumah she'ena tachas pesach tefach b'rum tefach. If the tumah is not under an area which is a pesach tefach, b'rum tefach al tefach b'rum tefach, is harei kiritzutza. So it has a kiritzutza. Mela, this din over here knows under each beam was bemis itself an oil. Originally, under each beam was itself oil. Now the chiddush is that these oyahalim merge. These oyahalim merge. But Rashainkan, if the tumah was mechatchila not under an oil, so something that's not an oil can't merge. That's it. Now, bayis shenizdak gage uksolov v'nasi shnei chalachim. There became a crack. You have a house, that the house has walls and a roof, and now there became a crack in the house. There's a crack in the walls and in the roof. V'hoisa tumah b'chetzi achitzin shapes lebei. And there was a tumah in that outside half. In other words, it's like here you're dividing the house into two halves, and you have a tumah in the outside half. So the din is hakelim shebechetzi apnimi kulam terim. It's considered a division, and since it's considered a division, because even a small crack, and therefore the outside house, the outside part of the house is tummy, but the inside part of the house, which is beyond that crack, is tar, because the oil doesn't extend. Over here, Ulachura was seeing that even if there's a minimal amount of difference between one oil and another oil, they don't merge. They don't merge. That's the question that we were asking before. If the size of this crack was like a plumb line, that was the size of that plumb line which you in order to measure whether or not the wall is straight. So if that was the size of the stock, it's kelim shebechetzi achitzim terim. Then that's considered enough of a separation to be metayr the kelim shebechetzi achitzim. However, and the reason for it is because there's a din of seifat tumalotzes. So now, since from the pnimi the tum is going to go out through the chitzin, so therefore, in order to be metayr the chitzin, you need a greater stock in order to metayr the chitzin. In order to metayr the pnimi, as long as there's a stock, so it's start. Mashengan over here, since from the pnimi it's going to go through the chitzin, so it has to be a greater separation in order to separate them. Now, aksadra shenizdika. Aksadra is an area which has a roof, but it doesn't have any walls. So there's no tzad pnimi and tzad chitzin. V'tumah b'tzad echad, and there's tumah on one side. There's a kale and there's a stock, and there's a crack in the roof of the aksadra. There's a kalim sheb'tzad hasheni teir. Shareim kishnei yeholim zeh b'tzad zeh. It's like two separate yeholim, one next to each other, v'aver b'neim. Sharei azdak b'chol hatikra, because you have a stock over the entire roof. Now, nasul ragle ikonim l'mayla stock. If you covered this stock, so the din is erev satumah. So now the stock is covered. So therefore, it doesn't have to be covered the entire stock. As long as an area of a tefach is covered, so memela is erev satumah. Now that's talking about if you put the kona or the raglu b'mayla. Nosin sakona ba'aretz keneged a stock. You put it on the ground. You put a kona there. So the vafila keli gadol, you even put an entire keli, a large keli, is eini ma'arav satuma. It can be ma'arav satuma ad she gavei tefach tachas astak. So in other words, if you have a l'mashal like we had before with the gedera, if you have an elevated keli, and that elevated keli would be directly under the stock, so this elevated keli is in itself an oil. So mainly you have an oil on one side, you have an oil on the other side, and now you have the oil which is tachas hasdak, the part that's tachas hasdak, and that's combining the two oilim. So the two oilim become merged through the oil which is under the keli, which is elevated from the ground, a tefach. Masha'enkin, if there's no keli which is elevated from the ground, even though you have a large keli, maybe that large keli, the top part of the large keli, from the bottom part of the large keli, is a tefach, but it's all one keli. So we're not going to look at this keli like an oil, we're going to look at it as a keli, and therefore the stock separates it into two kelim, and the keli doesn't merge the two oilim. That's this din. Yeah, it has to be, in other words, if you have an elevated keli inside the house, but under the area where the stock is, where the split is, so that merges the two oilim. Now, if you have a person lying on the ground under this dock, is also ma'aravis atuma. He causes that the tuma knows that the ihalim, the one oil and the other oil should become combined. Why? Because adam cholu, a person is hollow. So therefore, we look at this person that the upper part of the person knows, from the upper part of the person to the lower part of the knows. We're talking about the width, the thickness. There's a person who's lying on the ground, so his top, his stomach, as opposed to his back. From the stomach to the back, there's a tefach. And we look at it as if from between the stomach and the back is hollow, and therefore we say, so there's an oil over here. Since there's an oil over here, so that oil is causing that the oil on one side and the oil on the other side should merge. Sha'adim cholu, vatzad elyon, the top part of him, there's the part of him that's lying, that's the top, that's facing the oil on top, is areu ka'el, she'esh gave a tefach. V'cheinim hoyu tachas azdak kelim mikupolim munachim al ha'aretz al gavizeh. You have a bunch of towels, that you have a pile of towels, and the pile of towels is a tefach large. See, a number of towels. And v'hoyu elyon goveim al ha'aretz tefach. And the top one from the ground was a tefach. So even though there's no real space in between the top one and the lower one, and the floor, because they're all filled with kalim, but nevertheless, it was a kalim, just like by the person. The person we say, even though there's he's considered hollow, and knows everything that's in him is within him, but there's the top part of him and the lower part of him, and we're separating it. So the dar is over here, there's the bunch of kalim, so therefore the top keli is considered like the oil, which is a tefach above the ground, and in that area there's other kalim. It's one keli, you don't say it. Masha'ik, with a number of kalim, you do say it. So haya elvin gaveim alaris tefach is irav satuma. Therefore, v'chol ha'kelim shalamatim in anorim kelim shetachas oil. So if you have, for example, on one side you have tuma, on the other side you don't have tuma. So until now you weren't ma'arav, the tuma didn't go from one side to the other. But now that you have a pile of kalim in between, under this dock, so it causes that the tuma should extend from one place to the other. And Mamela, obviously, all those kalim are going to become tummy. Even those kalim that are not under the oil, which actually has the kalim, or the part of the side of the stock which has the kalim.